Hello, this is the lecture for Ancient and Medieval History for Monday, March 22nd, 2021. Last week we covered the four eras of imperial history: the Principate, the Pax Romana, the Crisis, and the Dominate. And we looked in detail at how emperors reigned, at how the Christian faith spread, at how the Roman army and the Roman government changed, at what went wrong, at what went right, at who did well and who did not. And we end up with a Roman Empire in the Dominate that is practically alien from the period of the Principate or the Pax Romana. Instead of having any pretense of being a republic, the army still march under SPQR, but the empire is an out-and-out theocratic monarchy, where the emperor is treated almost in a godlike fashion, reverential fashion. Now, sacrificing incense to the emperor was something the Romans had done. But up until the end of the crisis in Diocletian, Roman emperors had basically been people. They had been seen as people, as great men, but as men. Under the Dominate, that changes. And this becomes the most serious as the empire gets more Christian and more desperate, to the point where Theodosius the Great, the last emperor of a unified emperor who reigns in the late 300s, his coinage view him almost like a saint of Christ while alive on earth, which is saying something. So let's look at Rome. And the general theme here is important bits of Roman imperial lore, but also we are sort of beginning to address the question in a more comprehensive way of why does this edifice fall? Why does the Roman Empire in the West fall? And there are a variety of reasons that you should be conversant with, and today and tomorrow's lecture should get you that way. First off, we talked about the problems of imperial succession. What are ways that you can tell who the next emperor will be when the old emperor dies? Well, if the old emperor had a son, and especially had a chance to train that son up in the emperor biz, giving him public accolades, recognition, jobs to do, things like that, then, and the empire was stable, then it might be the hereditary son or nephew or whatever. So heredity is a possibility. That's what gave us Commodus, or gave them Commodus. Then there's adoption, which is, in terms of the empire at least, superior to heredity. Because with adoption, you can choose a person based on their qualities. You can have any kind of child. Just like you can have any kind of parent. I'm sure if you were asked right now for a survey of traits that you'd want in your parents, hopefully some of the traits your parents have would be ones you would choose. But I suspect, knowing how things are often between teenagers and their parents, that there are some qualities you wouldn't mind adjusting a little bit if you had an opportunity to have a perfect parent. Well, that same thing is true for parents. Sometimes kids are not what the parents expect. So heredity is a crapshoot. It's a roll of the dice. I'm going to turn this on. If it bothers you, again, feel free to move. Adoption is a much more purposeful and certain way of at least doing your level best to pick the right person for the job of emperor. But adoption doesn't work if you've got a son. Adoption also doesn't work if you're desperate. If the current emperor is weak or desperate, it's entirely possible that they won't get to choose their successor. It's even entirely possible that they won't get to choose how they leave this world. Somebody else will choose it for them. Weakness invites attack. That's just a law of nature. And it is a law in human society, no matter how much idealists try to deny it or change it. Weakness invites attack. So if the emperor is weak, the emperor is implicitly inviting some kind of rebellion or assassination attempt or something like that, or civil war. So then you've got what happened with Trajan, a compromise appointment. Trajan, the general of the armies at the beginning of the Pax Romana, chooses to have the Senate make the choice, and the Senate chooses the old Senator Nerva to be emperor, and that legitimizes it when Trajan becomes emperor a couple of years later because Nerva's health is lousy. This gives the illusion of senatorial power, and it also sets the tone for negotiating thoughtfully about who will be the next emperor. And this happens big time with Trajan's successor Hadrian, who not only selects his successor in the form of Antoninus Pius, but he selects Antoninus' successors in the form of Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius. But again, such choices only come from strength. If the emperor is strong, if the empire is strong, if there are things going on that make it possible for an emperor not only to control the present, but to try to cast his shadow over the future. No, as the empire grows weak, desperate, divided, war-torn, and worse, force more and more becomes the way that the imperial succession is decided. Now, the weakest force, but the closest to imperial power, at least before the crisis, is the Praetorian Guard. They're the emperor's bodyguard. Praetorians choose Claudius. They kill Caligula and choose Claudius. Praetorians have something to do with the death of Domitian, and they are certainly involved in the compromise Trajan sets up with Nerva. The Praetorians are deeply involved in killing Commodus, and they auction off the Imperium on the palace steps to Pesinius Niger, I think it is, or Pertinax. In any event, the problem with the Praetorians is, what if the armies in the field don't agree? The armies in the field don't like the Praetorians because the Praetorians are sort of these shiny tin soldiers that march and deal with civilians, whereas the soldiers in the field have to deal with barbarians like the Germans, the Goths, and another nation like the Parthians or Persians. So, army proclamations often are the way things work, and after a while, nobody cares what the Praetorians think because they disintegrate during the crisis. They're there at the beginning, they're not really there at the end, not in the same way. Instead, you got the army group on the Rhine, which is smaller than the army groups on the Danube, which is smaller than the army group facing the Persians. The person who won the first civil war, the year of 4 emperors, after Nero dies, was Vespasian, commander in the east, biggest army. The winner of the second civil war, after the death of Commodus, was Septimus Severus, general of the Eastern Army. And so the armies proclaim, and they fight civil wars with one another. Why do the armies proclaim? Because they get paid to win. And if an emperor is proclaimed, he will usually pay a donative now, which is a bonus of money to those people who are the emperor's soldiers, or the would-be emperor's soldiers, and then they pay another donative if they win. So if you're a greedy soldier, and why not? Why shouldn't your general be the emperor? Why shouldn't you get more pay? Why shouldn't the donatives have it? But this creates a state of existential insecurity. Diocletian comes up with the most reasonable answer, the Tetrarchy. There are 4 imperial field armies in Diocletian's time under his military reforms. Each field army has a general. Each general becomes an emperor, either a junior emperor, a Caesar, or a senior emperor, an Augustus. With term limits, even. Diocletian always looks for legal systems to solve problems. But unfortunately for him, once he retires, his power to enforce his will is kaput. And the emperors that succeed him do not appoint Caesars. They don't appoint junior emperors. Instead, they fight each other for control. And those civil wars continue until Constantine the Great beats Licinius. By this point, Diocletian is dead. He lived just long enough to see his tetrarchy system fall apart. Not a happy time. But it was an attempt. So now we're back to this. Heredity, which works for the Constantines, adoption, compromise, and force. Bit of heredity, a lot of force. That problem dogs Rome until the end of the Western Empire. And it's still something that dogs Byzantium a little bit, but not nearly to the extent as it does the Western Roman Empire. Meanwhile, the threats to Rome from the outside, this is a cause of Rome's devolution and destruction, of its decline and fall. First of all, the geography of the Roman Empire involves long river borders. Rome is built around a sea, the Mediterranean Sea. So it's an empire that doesn't have a strong center. It has this area, which is a maritime highway. But it's not like the Mongol Empire that has a heartland. Rome is like a donut. Donuts have holes in the center. Rome has the Mediterranean Sea sort of as a whole. So the Romans need to invest in ships and sea power in order to control that sea, to keep pirates and others from exploiting it. They fail once with the Goths. Remember, the Goths used their ships, Roman ships, to raid the east. But other than that, for the most part, Rome keeps control of the sea. And Rome builds a series of roads to project its power from the Mediterranean coast inland and away. But in addition to having a sea in the center, making Rome a donut rather than a cookie, Rome has these weird long borders. Now, the border in the east is about as good as you're going to get. There's throughout history been a division between what we would call Syria and what we would call Iraq. Somewhere in the northern Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, there's a division. And that division has been there since the world's first civilization, Sumer, in southern Iraq, was captured by Akkad in northern Iraq. So the border in the east is about as good as it's going to get, but even it shifts. Armenia is sometimes Parthian or Persian, sometimes it's Roman. There are a bunch of other kingdoms up here that change hand. And when the Sassanids, the new Persian Empire, takes the place of the Parthians, this threat becomes much more, did I say much more serious than it used to. Persians are much more dangerous than the Parthians. But that's the East. You do what you can. And the fact that you're dealing with a civilization across the border means at least you can have peace treaties. The Persians don't raid Roman territory. If they come in force. Now let's look at the North African border. It's a desert. It's the Sahara Desert. Romans don't control very much into the Sahara Desert. They control basically the coastal plain, part of the Atlas Mountains, and the Nile River Valley up to, I think, the first cataract. So, who lives here in the desert? They're called Berbers. Berbers, B-E-R-B-E-R-S. It's what the kind of carpet is named after. And the Berbers are sort of like North Africa's version of the Arabs. They're desert people. They wander around from well to well, from camp to camp. They are nomadic. And nomads tend to be raiders. They tend to view people who settle down on farms as fat targets, as pigs for the slaughter. So this border has occasional, constant, low-grade attacks, and in Egypt there are stronger attacks along the Nile from what we would now call Sudan, what they would call Nubia. It's a long border. You really can't put a wall up. It's too long. But if you garrison it, chances are you can outfight any raiding party once you get troops into the field. Still, this is an exhausting border to defend. So you got the east, which is somewhat compact, and you're dealing with a civilization. You got the North African border, which is a long, low-grade threat. Then you got Britain, Hadrian's Wall, and during the time of the Pax Romana, the Antonine Wall, farther north. If you go to conquer an island, here's a hint: conquer the island, conquer it all. Because if you conquer it all, you don't have to have a land frontier. The problem is the British Isles are extensive. If Rome wants to conquer the north of Britain, that's a long way. It's a long way away. And it's still going to have Ireland to worry about. And the Irish are going to raid across the Irish Sea, which is what they do. That's how, in the Middle Ages, we get the story of St. Patrick. He's a Brit who is raided and stolen by Irish slavers. So the Romans, when they go into Britain, they do so to protect Gaul from raids from Britain. By controlling the south of Britain, what is now basically England and Wales, the Romans protect Gaul. But Britain is subject to Irish raids and to raids from the Picts north. So this needs to be garrisoned. Oh, that's tiring. It's a lot of frontier. But we're not even done yet. We now get to the worst parts of the frontier in terms of geography. This is basically the Rhine River. It flows from the Swiss Alps down to the North Sea near Antwerp, what is now Antwerp. It's a big river. This is the Danube. It also flows from the Swiss Alps south and east to debouch into the Black Sea. Yep. Them's some long river frontiers. Now, in the mountains, you have high country that makes it hard for people to cross. How hard is it to cross a river?
Depends how long it is.
Yeah. Let's say you have boats or the ability to swim. How hard is it to cross a river? Yeah. You can swim across it. You can take boats across it. Yes, if it's a strong river, it's going to have a current. Yeah, they might have white water in places. There are problems with rivers. And rivers are certainly chosen as borders because they are clearly defined. My side of the river, your side of the river. Roman territory, barbarian territory. But rivers are not defensive works. Anyone who's serious about it, who's a human being capable of using logs, can cross the river. So what has to happen for these riverine frontiers to be strong is that the Romans need to garrison all along their length with periodic forts. They have to have ships on these rivers to show power and to attack, and they have to be willing to put people on the other side of the river to go scouting. But after the Pax Romana, once the crisis hits, the Romans stop scouting. They don't go east. They didn't anyway, because the Persians. They don't go deep into the desert. They don't go deep into the Picts lands. They don't go into Germania or into the Goth lands. They hunker down behind rivers. Try to imagine the next time you're at a beach in Post Falls, or if you're at the beach at the University of North Idaho in Coeur d'Alene, which is sort of where the lake feeds into the Spokane River. Try to imagine that that's the frontier, and on the other side are the barbarians. How safe do you feel behind the river? So the Romans have a geography problem. They have a very long frontier. Now, had the campaign with Germanicus and had Germany not been lost at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, the frontier at least would have been shorter. Rome would have controlled Germany. A lot of Germans might have become Romanized. And the border would have been the Elbe and the Danube, which is a shorter frontier, requiring less troops to man than this giant long frontier here. However, what ifs won't buy you lunch. They are not really worth very much. Speculative history. So Rome has a geography problem. It's not bad when Rome is strong. But as Rome gets weaker and more desperate, the length of its borders and the lack of fortification along them becomes a problem. Building walls works. That's why Hadrian builds a wall across the neck of Britain, and that's why the Antonines, under Antoninus Pius, build a wall farther north. That's why China invested in a great wall, because the barbarians are slowed down, and it allows the imperial army, which whether it's Rome or China's imperial army, to gather and to fight them off. Walls are a great jumping off point if you're going to go into enemy territory. But if you expect a piece of masonry to keep people out, human beings out, we're human beings. We can build ladders. We can build hooks that can rip walls down. We can undermine walls, digging tunnels, shoring them up with wood, burning the wood, collapsing the tunnels, collapsing the walls. We can do all sorts of things. Fortifications work if you have strong soldiers manning them. If you don't, it's a problem. And as Rome gets older and weaker, it's more and more of a problem. We talked about how when the Germans are joined by the Goths, the threat on the northern frontier, the Rhine-Danube frontier, doubles at least, maybe triples, depending upon how you want to measure it and when you're talking. So you've got a massively new threat in the Persian Empire, and you've got a much bigger threat with the Goths joining the Germans. All of these things are going to contribute to Rome's exhaustion. Rome's monetary exhaustion, not enough money. Rome's military exhaustion, not enough good troops. Rome's moral exhaustion. Do we really care about holding these frontiers? Is it worth the lives of my nephew or my son or my husband or my father? Yes.
Especially at this time, most of the emperors came from like a military background. How come they didn't? How come they just made such poor strategic decisions, like not pulling back?
Well, where's there to pull back to? In the east, if you pull back, you give up the Levantine coast. You give up the coast of Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. Can't do that. That splits the empire and exposes Egypt, and Egypt is the breadbasket of the empire. If you pull back from the Danube, you can pull back to the Balkan Mountains, but they have passes through them. Rome tried holding Dacia, which has the Carpathian Mountains, where Dracula eventually lives. But ultimately, the crisis puts paid to Roman Dacia. The Romans try to control this triangle here between the central Rhine and the upper Danube, but during the crisis, they lose it. And after the crisis, they have the oomph to hold the ground, but they don't have the oomph to do much invading. Unfortunately, by then, you can have all the vision in the world, but it's too late if you don't have the forces to make those dreams happen. Does that make sense?
So just back into a wall and just
Yeah.
really do much.
And there's nothing better to do than hold that wall, or hold that frontier, hold that river, whatever, for as long as you possibly can. So it's this problem that is going to bring some changes. I'm going to go through these vocab terms on the quick side. You've heard many of them, but I want to make sure that you know them. The term barbarian comes from the word barbari, which means babbler. Anyone who doesn't speak Greek or Latin is a barbarian, according to the Romans. The barbarians are the babblers. They are the speakers of other languages than Greek and Latin. So by their definition, the Persians are barbari, although the Persians are civilized. Parthian. The Parthians are the people that occupy the Middle East before the Persians. They are famous for their Parthian shot, where they basically turn around on their horses. The horses are continuing to go this way, and the Parthians fire backwards. It's a very effective tactic against slower forces. Germans are blonde-haired, blue-eyed, cream-skinned barbarians from across the Rhine and north of the Danube who are warriors. They like war. War is fun for them, and they tend to be very good at it. Persians take over the Parthian lands at the beginning of the 3rd century. They were the same rulers of the old empires that attacked Greece. Another word for Persian is Iranian. So today's country of Iran, land of the Aryans, used to be called Persia. An alternative name for Iranians are Persians. In fact, during World War II, to avoid confusion between Iraq and Iran, Churchill and the British insisted that Iraq always be followed by a parenthetical Q to remind people it's Iraq, Q, definitely Iraq, not Iran. And the Iranians were called Persians in all government documents for the duration of the war. Because think about how easy it is. You get one letter wrong and suddenly your bombs are landing in the wrong country. That would be bad. So, Persia, another name is Iranians. Goths are people that come from Scandinavia. They're like super Germans. They're bigger than the Germans. They're tougher than the Germans. They're like early Vikings. In fact, they are the same people that eventually produced the Vikings. They are bigger and stronger than the Germans. And they are going to increase the threat level to Rome significantly. We haven't talked about the Huns or Attila yet. We will. The Mediterraneans. The Mediterraneans of Marcus Aurelius. The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius is his book written to himself about things, life, the universe, everything. Because the only person he could talk to, have an honest conversation with, was himself. Intense specialization is one cause of the fall of Rome's empire. Intense specialization. Let me explain how that works. If we lost electricity, our civilization, for a long period of time on a large scale, our civilization would probably come to a grinding halt. Without electricity, most of us don't know how to keep ourselves warm over the long haul, get food over the long haul, because without electricity, modern vehicles don't work. Without electricity, there's no air travel. So we would have to adapt. But most adults, and many of you, have already pigeonholed themselves into a specialization. I'm a teacher. I'm not a hunter. I'm not a fisherman. Some teachers are. I'm not. The problem with specialization is that if things go to hell, you may not be able to make a living being a sculptor. You might have to understand how to farm. Now, if the power had gone out in the 1920s, we hadn't really gotten used to it yet, not too used to it. We could have handled it. But now it's the 2020s. And we are over 120 years from most of us, our ancestors, getting electricity. We have specialized. We depend on computers, we depend on electronics, we depend on all sorts of techniques that are easy to mess up. And if an enemy were to attack us, part of the attack would be on our power grid and on our computer systems and everything else in order to make it hard for us to fight them. They would certainly do that. That's what I would do if I were them. And if we do that to the Chinese, well, that'll hurt them, but they're not as dependent as we are. They're not as advanced as we are. The Romans become hyper-specialized too. They become very good at filling their niche. But their niche changes when society goes through the crisis. So, intense specialization, the Romans get too specialized, and it makes them harder to adapt when society approaches a dark age. Hyperinflation we talked about. Hyperinflation happens when people lose confidence that money is valuable. So each unit of money loses value. And instead of taking one silver piece to buy yourself a good dog, it takes 10 or 50 or 100 to buy yourself a good dog. Because each silver piece is worth less, and the very concept of money is being called into question. The Chi-Rho is the monogram of Christ. It looks like a P with an X crossing it. It's from Christos in Greek, which is what the Messiah is in the Greek language. Martyr is someone who dies for the faith. Lots of Christians were martyred under the Roman persecutions. They had a chance to deny Christ. They refused to. They died for their faith. Lots of Jews have been martyred throughout history. They are offered a chance to deny God. They refuse. They die. Martyrs. Martyrs. Martyrs are important to a faith because they indicate that there are things more important than another day on this world. And belief in truth is one of those things. Sold themselves into slavery. On Friday, I talked about this. So you have Romans who are dealing with such high tax rates that they're wealthy, but they're being expected by the government to build a new set of baths or a new aqueduct or a new city walls. You just after a while can't get blood from a stone. These so-called wealthy Romans don't have any more to give. But the government's going to put them to the torture, or worse, if they don't provide these things to their communities. So a lot of Romans begin to sell themselves into slavery. Imagine being a wealthy person. Imagine how bad it would have to be for you to become property in order to escape the government and its taxes. That's what begins to happen to such an extent that the Roman government does what? The Roman government makes laws that say you have to do what your father did, which is lousy if your father was a doctor and you don't have a touch for it. Not great for your patients either. So the taxes that paid for the new military and all these walls ended up breaking a lot of successful families. The economy was not in a good shape. Another cause, which isn't on your notes, is the word decadence. D-E-C-A-D-E-N-C-E. D-E-C-A-D-E-N as in November, C-E. Decadence. What is decadence? Decadence is where you get freaky weird. Where you've had it good for so long that you've lost touch with reality. You become obsessed with sex. You become obsessed with luxury. You become obsessed with getting the right kind of table salt. You become obsessed with minutia. You're soft. You're used to going to the baths. You're used to having massage. You're used to having hot tubs and places to swim. You're used to having good food all the time. You never rough it. You never go out into nature and camp. You never fight. Decadence comes in many forms. But basically the definition is people who have it so good that they lose their edge. People who have it so good that they lose their edge. People who have it so good that they lose their edge. Now, if everything is going peaceful and smooth, you may not need that edge. But if suddenly things get bad, you kind of do. Otherwise, you're going to have your stuff stolen and yourself abused, and ultimately you'll become somebody's slave. It's like being weak in a modern prison. It's not a good place to be if you're not strong. Decadence is often seen also as a propensity towards genuinely bizarre tastes in terms of sex and drugs. In fact, living your life for perversion or living your life for narcotics. Both of those things are considered to be decadent also. So a lot of people who look at the fall of Rome say that the Romans had it good, so good for so long, at least their upper classes, that they lost their edge. And this thing that they had in building orgy rooms and building vomitoriums, which are rooms where in a big feast your guests can go and purge so that they can clean their mouth off and continue to eat. So you can eat for 12 straight hours. The human body's not designed for that, but the Romans make it possible with the vomitorium. That's decadent. Having an orgy room is decadent. having baths, some people consider hot baths, is decadent. I don't, but some people do. So have the Romans, the leadership anyway, had it so good for so long that they lose their edge? Arguably, yeah. That's a cause of the fall of the Roman Empire. Who are the Zealots? They're the anti-Roman Jewish terrorists of the time of Christ and just after. The Zealots are wiped out at Masada in the First Jewish War with Rome. Now here's another thing. There are going to be, the next two things are not in your list either. One is lead soldering in pipes. So write that down. Lead, L-E-A-D, soldering, S-O-L-D-E-R-I-N-G, soldering, S-O-L-D-E-R-I-N-G. It's a weirdly spelled word, but there it is. Lead soldering in pipes. We're Romans. We have the baths. We're Romans. We have the aqueducts. We're Romans. We've got fresh running water. And all of it has lead soldering in the pipes. What does lead do to your nervous system? Do any of you know? If you do, you can stop me singing. Yes?
It's like poison.
Yeah, slowly. Now, it doesn't necessarily kill you. Hello, gravity. Do you know what it does? Yeah?
It drives you crazy.
Yeah! It affects your nervous system. And it makes you stupid. It increases birth defects. It makes you stupid. It decreases your mental stability. And it makes you stupid. Now, I say that 3 times in case any of you, God forbid, had lead paint in your homes, which used to be a thing, but really hasn't been in the time of my lifetime, so you shouldn't have to worry about it at all, unless you're going somewhere really old. Lead paint. Little babies. Oh, it's peeling. Nom, 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 nom. So back in the early 20th century, a lot of people used lead paint in their homes, and suddenly their kids are getting lead poison. And it messes with their nervous system. So the Roman people, for about 500 years in some places, for 200 years in others, for between 200 to 500 years, have generation after generation after generation after generation after generation drinking water with lead soldering in the pipes. That's a cause of the fall of the Roman Empire. You might wonder, why the hell don't these people get smart? Maybe they can't. Maybe the lead poisoning interferes with them so much that they can't. We're going to leave it there just before the last new term. Tomorrow I plan to tell you the story of the fall. That story may go into Wednesday. If it doesn't, your exam's on Wednesday. If it does, your exam's on Thursday. Your exam is on the Roman Empire almost exclusively. So you don't need to worry too much about the Republic or Christianity. It is almost exclusively on the notes I've been giving the last couple of weeks on the Empire. Zoe.
Okay, so start. You did sort of have lead soldering in the pipes, except you just didn't. You just had the word lead, and also you still have to go over the Huns and T.
As I say. Now, I'm going to do that over here, as you can see.
Oh, I see now.
Yeah. So I decided to wait on that.
Never mind then.
No, thank you for pointing it out. As you pointed out several things that I've made mistakes about over the months, and I don't like making mistakes. By accident. Yeah. You at home, make sure to take the quiz. I'll be emailing it to you this afternoon, sometime between now and 3.